Long ago, in the land of Canaan, there lived a man named Jacob who had 12 sons. Joseph was the second youngest, and his father's favorite. Jacob gave Joseph a beautiful coat of many colors, which made his older brothers seethe with jealousy. One day, Joseph's brothers were tending their flocks in a distant field while Joseph remained at home. Jacob asked Joseph to go check on his brothers and report back. Eager to please his father, Joseph set off to find them. When the brothers saw Joseph approaching in the distance, his splendid coat shimmering in the sun, their hearts filled with envious rage. "Here comes that dreamer," said one brother bitterly, recalling the strange dreams Joseph had shared in which he reigned supreme over the family. "Let's kill him and throw him in a pit. We'll tell father that a wild animal devoured him." But the eldest brother Reuben objected to this murderous plan. "Let's not take his life. We can throw him in this empty cistern here in the wilderness, but let's not lay a hand on him directly." Reuben said this intending to rescue Joseph later and take him back to their father. So when Joseph arrived, his brothers stripped him of his precious coat. They seized him and cast him into the dry well, ignoring his desperate pleas. Then they callously sat down to eat a meal, leaving Joseph alone in the dark depths. Soon, a caravan of Ishmaelite traders passed by on their way to Egypt. One brother, Judah, said, "What will we gain by killing our brother? Let's sell him to these Ishmaelites instead." The others agreed, and they pulled Joseph out of the cistern. They sold their own brother into slavery for 20 shekels of silver. The Ishmaelites took Joseph away to Egypt. To cover up their terrible deed, the brothers slaughtered a goat and dipped Joseph's ornate coat in its blood. They brought the blood-soaked coat to their grief-stricken father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." Jacob recognized it immediately and cried out in anguish, concluding a ferocious beast had torn Joseph to pieces. He rent his garments and mourned many days, inconsolable in his sorrow. Meanwhile, the Ishmaelites sold Joseph to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials in Egypt. But the Lord was with Joseph, and he found favor with his master, rising to a position of responsibility over the entire household. However, misfortune befell Joseph again when Potiphar's wife, after failing to seduce him, falsely accused Joseph of misconduct. Despite his innocence, Joseph was thrown in prison. Yet even there, God granted Joseph favor in the eyes of the prison warden. The warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners. During this time, 2 royal officials who had offended Pharaoh were also imprisoned. One night, each official had a perplexing dream. Noticing their downcast expressions the next morning, Joseph inquired about their troubles. They shared their dreams with him, hoping for an interpretation. With divine insight, Joseph explained the meanings of their dreams, accurately predicting that one would be restored to his former position while the other would face execution. Joseph humbly requested, "Remember me when things go well for you. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. For I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." 3 days later, everything transpired exactly as Joseph had foretold. Pharaoh restored his chief cupbearer to his previous station, but the chief baker was put to death. However, in his good fortune, the cupbearer forgot all about Joseph, leaving him languishing in prison for 2 full years. Then Pharaoh himself had 2 disturbing dreams that baffled all the wise men and magicians of Egypt. In his dreams, 7 gaunt, ugly cows devoured 7 sleek, well-fed cows, yet remained just as emaciated as before. Likewise, 7 thin, shriveled heads of grain swallowed up 7 full, healthy heads of grain. At last, the chief cupbearer remembered Joseph and told Pharaoh of the captive Hebrew youth's uncanny ability to interpret dreams. Pharaoh immediately sent for Joseph, who was hastily brought from the dungeon. After bathing and shaving, Joseph stood before the mighty ruler of Egypt. In humility, Joseph disclaimed any personal skill in dream interpretation. "I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires," he declared. After hearing the dreams, Joseph proclaimed their divine message. 7 years of abundant harvests would be followed by 7 years of severe famine throughout Egypt and the surrounding lands. He advised Pharaoh to appoint a wise administrator to store up grain during the years of plenty to prepare for the approaching time of need. Impressed by the Spirit of God evident in Joseph, Pharaoh appointed him as governor over all Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself. At the age of 30, Joseph was placed in charge of the entire land. Just as he had foretold, 7 bountiful years were followed by 7 years of devastating famine. But under Joseph's prudent management, Egypt had wisely stockpiled grain and now had more than enough to feed its people and still sell to foreigners desperate for food. In the land of Canaan, Jacob and his family also felt the famine's brutal grip. Jacob heard there was grain available in Egypt, so he sent his 10 older sons to purchase food, keeping only Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother, at home. Arriving in Egypt, the brothers came before Joseph to buy grain. Although they did not recognize him, Joseph immediately knew them. Rather than revealing his identity right away, Joseph spoke harshly, accusing them of being spies. Protesting their innocence, the brothers explained they were 10 sons of one man from Canaan, with one brother no longer living and the youngest remaining at home with their father. Joseph demanded proof, insisting they must bring their youngest brother to him. He kept one brother, Simeon, in prison as a guarantee of their return. Shaken, the brothers discussed this misfortune as divine retribution for their past sin against Joseph, not realizing he could understand their words. Deeply moved, Joseph turned away to weep privately before composing himself. He provided them with grain and had their silver payment secretly returned in the sacks, then sent them on their way. Upon discovering the returned money, the brothers grew even more fearful. When they recounted everything to Jacob, he refused to let Benjamin leave, having already lost Joseph. But as the famine worsened, they had no choice but to return to Egypt for more food, this time with Benjamin. Seeing Benjamin with them, Joseph invited the brothers to a feast at his house. Terrified, they tried to explain the money in their sacks, but Joseph's steward reassured them. At the feast, Joseph showed favor to Benjamin with extra portions, while carefully watching his brothers' reactions. The next morning, he ordered their sacks filled with grain and had his own silver cup planted in Benjamin's. Shortly after leaving the city, the brothers were overtaken by Joseph's steward, who accused them of theft. Horrified, they vowed that if the cup was found with any of them, that man would become Joseph's slave. But when the cup was discovered in Benjamin's sack, they all tore their clothes in anguish and returned to face Joseph. Judah stepped forward, offering himself as a slave in Benjamin's place. He emotionally recounted their father's deep grief over Joseph's presumed death and pleaded that losing Benjamin would surely bring their aged father to the grave in sorrow. Unable to control himself any longer, Joseph sent all his attendants out of the room. Weeping loudly, he said to his shocked brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" His brothers were speechless with dismay and terror. But Joseph reassured them, saying, "Come close to me. I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." He explained how God had orchestrated events to preserve their family during the famine and urged them to bring Jacob and the entire clan to settle in Egypt, where Joseph would provide for them. Astonished and overjoyed, the brothers embraced Joseph, weeping together. Pharaoh was pleased to hear of this reunion and offered the best land in Egypt for Joseph's family to occupy. Joseph provided his brothers with changes of clothes and sent abundant provisions for their journey, instructing them not to quarrel on the way. They returned to Canaan with the incredible news that Joseph was alive and ruler of all Egypt. At first Jacob could not believe it, but when he saw the wagons Joseph had sent, his spirit revived. "My son Joseph is still alive," he declared. "I must go and see him before I die." So Jacob and his whole family, 70 persons in all, moved to Egypt with all their livestock and possessions. Joseph prepared his chariot and went to Goshen to meet his father. They embraced and wept for a long time. "Now I am ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive," Jacob told Joseph. Joseph brought his father to Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Then Joseph settled his father and brothers in the region of Ramesses, the best part of the land. He supplied them with food and cared for them throughout the remaining years of famine. Jacob lived in Egypt 17 years until he reached the age of 147. Near death, he made Joseph swear to bury him back in Canaan, in the cave where Abraham and Isaac were buried. He blessed Joseph's 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and bestowed prophetic blessings on all 12 of his own sons before breathing his last. After a profound time of mourning, Joseph fulfilled his promise and laid his father to rest in Canaan. Now their father was gone, and Joseph's brothers feared he would at last take revenge on them. But Joseph wept at this notion and tenderly reassured them, "Do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your children." Joseph lived to see his grandchildren and even great-grandchildren. Before his death at 110 years old, he shared his unshakable faith with his brothers, saying, "God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." He made them swear to carry his bones up from Egypt when that day arrived. Then Joseph died, was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt, his enduring trust in God's promises pointing toward the future hope and destiny of his people.